Under the cold light of the Velari homeworld's triple moons, the grand hall of the crystal spire buzzed with tension, not joy. 1,000 shimmering banners fluttered silently as the last Velari nobles stood in perfect rows, their expressions unreadable behind elegant masks that hid more than just their faces. While on the other side of the chamber, in sharp contrast, stood a small, rugged group of humans, soldiers, diplomats, and one tall man with a scar across his cheek and eyes like distant storms, Captain Elias Grant, who had fought for Earth in a war that had burned half the stars between their worlds, and now stood, not as a victor, but as a groom. Beside him, standing still as carved ice, was Princess Sirea Velari, the youngest daughter of the Empress, a woman of legend and sorrow, whose psychic voice had never once touched a human mind, for she had chosen silence since the day the war took her brother, her home fleet, and much of her faith. This wedding was not for love, not even for duty. It was survival, a fragile thread spun between species on the brink of mutual destruction. And as the ancient treaty was read aloud in both Velari light code and human speech, Elias's eyes never left the princess, whose luminous silver skin and translucent robes made her seem more ghost than bride. But it was her silence that weighed the heaviest. She never spoke, never gestured, never even blinked when Elias, in a voice steady but unsure, repeated the vows handed to him by the diplomat beside him. She simply stared, and the hall felt colder for it. Once the final seal was marked on the binding stone, the ceremony ended, not with applause, but with the long chime of the Velari memory gong, and the newlyweds were escorted away, alone together now in a high chamber of the coalition ship Resolute, surrounded by unfamiliar stars. Elias stood awkwardly, trying not to tower too much, watching her sit with elegance far too practiced, her face unreadable, her presence as quiet as a vacuum, and though he had expected anger, or at least scorn, he felt none, only stillness, a calm that made his nerves scream louder. He tried to speak, asked if she needed anything, wanted water, food, rest, anything, but she said nothing, and the silence pressed tighter with every second, like invisible wires around his throat. Days passed in this strange limbo aboard the Resolute, with Elias growing more restless and Sirea remaining motionless, except for her slow walks at dawn cycle through the ship's botanical deck, where she'd pause by the Terran pine trees and touch their bark with a look almost mournful. The crew treated her like glass, unsure whether she was royalty or prisoner, and Elias hated how they whispered, but said nothing, partly because he didn't know what to say himself. Then one night the ship's alarms shattered the quiet. A piercing shriek of warning lights, red pulses flooding the halls as the voice of Commander Jun barked orders over the intercom. An unidentified craft had dropped out of FTL too close to their flank, ignoring hails, weapons charging, and before they could react, a burst of psionic energy struck the ship like a hammer of pure thought, sending crew members collapsing with nosebleeds, lights flickering, systems stalling. Elias, sprinting through smoke-filled corridors, found Sirea already standing in the atrium, eyes glowing faintly, arms raised, a shimmering psychic shield flaring around her as another blast came crashing down. But this time the shield held, and he watched in awe as the force bent around her, refracted into nothing. Then the shield collapsed, and Sirea swayed, catching herself against a rail, her lips trembling, her breathing shallow, and Elias rushed forward without thinking, catching her as she nearly fell. The first time he'd touched her, and the moment their skin connected, a whisper echoed faintly in his skull, not in words, but in meaning. "You don't belong in my silence." And then she fainted in his arms. The attack was repelled shortly after, the unknown craft disabled by drone defense. But the mystery lingered. How had she protected the ship? Why had the attackers used psychic weapons, and why? When Elias stayed by her side through the night, in the medbay, did her heart rate only stabilize when his hand was near hers? Questions filled the ship like smoke, but none dared speak them aloud, especially not Elias, who now sat beside her bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, and wondering if this strange, silent princess, bound to him by politics and pain, might be hiding something far greater than anyone expected. And as he watched her eyes flutter beneath closed lids, he felt that same whisper brushing the edge of his thoughts again, stronger this time, clearer. "Why did you protect M?" And for the first time since the war, Elias Grant had no answer. Elias sat on the edge of the cold medical cot, staring at the pale shape of Princess Sirea Valari as she rested under the soft glow of the medbay lights, her silver skin catching the light like moonlit water, her eyes closed but her fingers twitching as if reaching for something far away. It had been 2 days since the psychic attack, and the memory of the moment when her voice, no, her thought had touched his mind, still echoed inside him like a whisper caught in a canyon, not loud, but impossible to forget. He didn't understand how it happened or why, but he knew that whatever wall separated her from the human world had cracked, and he had been standing on the other side of it, just close enough to see through. No one else on the Resolute had felt her mind. No one else had seen the shimmering shield or heard the faint cry that wasn't sound at all, just meaning raw and direct. When she finally stirred, her eyes opening slowly to the ceiling, Elias leaned forward, unsure what to say, until her gaze found him, and he realized she wasn't looking at him, but into him, and though her lips remained closed, he felt something stir again inside his thoughts. Not words this time, but a wave of emotion, tiredness, sadness, and something that felt almost like confusion, all pressing gently into his mind before fading like smoke in wind. Then she blinked, sat up slowly, and turned her head toward the small window showing stars crawling past, her fingers folding neatly in her lap as though she were trying to collect herself. And Elias stood in silence, not wanting to break this moment, but feeling it already slipping away. Later that cycle, the two were summoned by Commander John for a debrief in the ship's strategy chamber, where a projection of the attacking vessel hovered above the table like a ghost made of blue. Light clearly Valari in design, but older, its markings erased or damaged, its energy signature nearly untraceable. It wasn't a pirate ship, John said, looking at them with a grim face. It was something else, something designed to disrupt your mind, Princess. And at those words, Sirea's hand flinched slightly, though she said nothing, not even telepathically. Elias stepped forward, his voice calm but firm, asking what they planned to do, and June replied that a diplomatic investigation would begin once they reached the Caltras Moon Station, where their official wedding ceremony would take place in front of both species councils. Hearing the word wedding felt strange now, like it belonged to another timeline, but Elias glanced at Saraya and saw the faintest crease at the edge of her brow, the only sign that she had heard and possibly felt the same way. In the days that followed, the atmosphere aboard the Resolute shifted. Velari crew members began to watch Elias more closely, whispering in their silent way, with long looks and shorthand signs, while humans walked more carefully near the princess, as if unsure whether to treat her as a symbol, a weapon, or a time bomb waiting to go off. Still, every morning she returned to the botanical deck, walking slowly among the Terran plants, and Elias found himself walking with her, sometimes a few steps behind, sometimes beside her, always quiet, until one morning she paused near a flowering tree with bright red blossoms and turned to him, her eyes wide, and suddenly he heard her again, not a sentence, not a question, but one single clear word in his mind: fire. Startled, he looked at the petals, then at her, and asked softly, "You mean the color?" But she shook her head, eyes still fixed on the bloom, and then slowly raised her hand, fingers glowing faintly, and let her palm rest on the trunk of the tree. For a moment Elias thought she might burn it, but instead the glow faded, and her hand fell. That night Elias couldn't sleep. Her voice, the way it reached into his mind so gently, unlike anything he had known, kept returning to him, and he found himself wondering what kind of thoughts lived behind that silence. The next morning a new message came from Caltris. The council expected them within 48 hours, and their ceremony would be broadcast across both worlds as a gesture of unity. Elias prepared himself as best he could, donning ceremonial robes he had only seen once before, while Saraya was dressed by her attendants in layers of soft crystal thread and light-woven silk that shimmered with every breath. The two met in the docking bay, standing opposite each other in silence before boarding the shuttle to Caltris together, and as the doors closed behind them, the tension in the small space was thick enough to crush sound. Halfway to the moon, something strange happened. Saraya suddenly reached forward and touched Elias's chest, not hard, just gently over the place where his heart beat. And in that instant he heard her again, but not just her. He felt her, memories flashing into his mind like lightning behind closed eyes. Her brother laughing beside a waterfall, then screaming as ships exploded in the sky above them. Her mother's hand on her shoulder, cold and heavy like armor. Herself alone in a dark room, listening to the voices of 1,000 grieving minds whispering in her skull. And then all at once him, Elias, standing on a battlefield, shouting, bleeding, refusing to fall. When the contact ended, Elias gasped and stepped back, shaken, and Saraya was already seated, again, head bowed, as if she hadn't just poured her life into him. Neither spoke, and when they landed on Caltris, the silence between them felt deeper than ever, not empty but full, heavy with things neither could explain. They were led into the Grand Assembly Tower, a spiraling structure made of white metal and clear stone, where leaders of both civilizations waited with practiced smiles and careful eyes. The wedding began beneath the twin moons, soft music playing from ancient instruments, the Lari and humans both watching in tense quiet as Elias stepped forward and took his place, his voice steady as he recited the vows that had been handed to him in 3 languages. When it was Saraya's turn, she remained still for a long moment, the air around her shimmering slightly, and then she raised her head and opened her mouth, but before any sound could come out, the sky above them turned. dark, a low hum filling the air as an energy wave surged through the tower, shattering the peace like glass. Screams erupted, guards raised weapons, and from the far end of the hall, a burst of psionic force struck directly at Soraya, too fast to block, but before it could hit her, Elias threw himself forward, arms out, body shielding hers as the wave crashed into him like fire and ice tearing through his skull. He fell to the ground with a groan, gasping, but alive when he should have been dead, and the gathered Villari gasped not in fear but in disbelief. No human mind should have withstood that kind of direct psychic attack, and yet here he was bleeding but breathing, his eyes wide and locked on Soraya's, whose own hands now trembled with energy barely contained. She stepped forward, knelt beside him, and then, without warning, spoke out loud for the first time, her voice quiet but clear, echoing across the silent hall. "You shouldn't be alive." Elias coughed, forced a smile, and whispered back, "I made a vow. I'm keeping it." And around them the silence deepened, not from fear, but from awe, as both humans and Villari stared, not at an ending, but at something beginning to burn. The great hall of the Countess Assembly Tower was filled with stunned silence as Princess Cyria's voice echoed through the air, a soft, clear sound that none had ever heard before, and Elias, lying bruised and dazed on the polished floor, blinked up at her as if she had become something new, something bright and strange. Her eyes, silver with faint glowing threads, remained locked on his, and for a moment it felt like the world had narrowed to only them, two souls tied not just by treaty, but now by something deeper, something unspoken yet powerful. Then the guards rushed forward, some Villari, some human, all unsure whether to aim weapons or offer help, and Soraya raised one hand, not in fear, but in command, her voice ringing again, stronger this time. "Stand down." The words came out, sharp, but beneath them, Elias could feel another layer, a wave of energy in the air that made every being in the room go still, as if her voice carried meaning far beyond sound. Medics came quickly and lifted Elias carefully, scanning the damage, whispering about neural spikes and memory flashes, but he waved them off, his eyes never leaving Soraya as she stepped beside him, calm and composed, though her hand still trembled slightly when no one looked too closely. Later, in a secured room high above the city, Elias sat with bandages across his ribs and a cold drink in hand, while Soraya stood near the window, staring at the stars beyond the glass, as if trying to read a hidden message. When he asked what had happened, she turned slowly and said just one word, "Warning." He waited, but nothing more came, and so he leaned forward and asked gently, "From who?" And she didn't answer with words, but instead walked over, sat beside him, and reached out her hand again, fingertips brushing his temple. And suddenly his mind lit up with images like memories, but not his own visions of a Villari ship drifting through empty space, its crew minds connected in harmony, until something foreign touched them, a voice not human and not Villari, dark and deep, whispering thoughts that weren't thoughts at all, just hunger. Then fire, then silence, and then her, standing alone before a council of elders, being told the truth in pieces some ancient thing had awoken beyond known space, and it was reaching out, testing minds like fingers testing glass, looking for cracks, and hers, gifted with rare clarity, had felt it first. When she pulled her hand back, Elias sat still, breathing hard, heart pounding, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Finally he asked what it wanted, and her reply was soft. "But sure, to learn us then unmake us." Over the next days the wedding was delayed, the councils uneasy, the alliance shaken by the attack and by the princess's sudden voice. But Elias and Saraya were kept together under quiet guard, not as prisoners but as something more complicated symbols. Secrets, maybe even weapons, depending on who you asked. Inside their shared chamber, however, the tension had shifted. She now spoke sometimes, short words, not many, but enough to change everything, asking questions, listening to his answers. Her voice always calm, her tone unreadable, but her eyes often soft. They spent hours walking the private sky garden of the tower, and one night while they watched the stars together, Saraya looked at Elias and said, "Our minds, they speak differently." He nodded, understanding that she meant more than just language, and asked if that made peace impossible. She shook her head slowly and replied, "No, just harder." He smiled at that, and for the first time she smiled too, just a little, and it was like watching a star flicker to life. But the peace did not last long. On the sixth night, an urgent message arrived from the Velari Science Outpost on the edge of charted space. A relay station had gone dark, and the last recorded signal showed strange patterns, not noise but not known. Speech either, something repeating, pulsing through the void like a heartbeat made of math and madness. The Velari called it the Gray Pulse, and the humans began running threat protocols. But Elias knew before they even asked that Saraya would insist on going. She said nothing at first, simply packed a small case, and stood near the doorway, waiting, and Elias followed without question, boarding a small scout ship under escort, with both Velari pilots and Terran Marines. The journey was quiet, tense, filled with low whispers and tighter security, and Saraya spent most of it in meditation, though now and then Elias would feel a gentle pressure in the back of his mind, not painful, just her presence checking in. A quiet signal of shared ground. When they reached the outpost, it was worse than they feared. No life signs, systems scrambled, metal twisted and melted in unnatural patterns, as if something had reached into the station and pulled its logic apart. The crew moved carefully through the wreckage, scanners humming, lights flickering, until they reached the central hub where the pulse had originated. And there, glowing faintly on a cracked display, was a string of symbols neither Velari nor human, but changing shape every few seconds, as if trying to find the right way to be understood. Saraya stepped closer, her eyes widening, and then she spoke a word in her native tongue, one that made the Velari guards freeze. Larati, an ancient name, long buried in myths, a race that had vanished before either species had written. History said to have spoken across galaxies using only thought, known to break stars like glass when they grew tired of what they found. Elias watched her closely and asked, "Are they coming back?" And her answer came with no delay. No, they never left. Suddenly alarms rang, another pulse, stronger, closer, shaking the deck under their feet, and the ship AI shouted. Warnings of a nearby rift opening in real space, something emerging, slow and massive. Saraya grabbed Elias's hand, her voice urgent now, no longer quiet. "We must go now." They ran through twisting halls as the metal groaned and lights flickered red, shadows dancing across the walls as if something unseen was pressing against them, trying to enter. As the shuttle lifted from the platform, the station behind them cracked in half without a sound. Floating debris sparkling in the dark like broken stars, and Elias turned to Syrea, breathless, asking, "What was it doing?" And she stared at the place the rift had been, eyes narrowed, and said, "Learning how we scream." The crew sat in stunned silence all the way back, the words hanging in the air like poison. And back at Caltris, panic spread in the higher. Councils, some called for war, others for evacuation, and still others for deeper study. But none of them truly understood what Elias and Syrea now knew, that they were no longer the center of their own story, and that something older, patient, and watching had chosen to speak, and through symbols, through pulses, through stolen voices and shattered minds, it had only just begun to learn the language between stars. The stars above Caltris spun slowly as the days passed, but peace no longer lived beneath their glow. Ever since the ancient rift had opened near the outpost, and the great pulse had echoed across both human and Velari systems, a quiet fear had settled over the Alliance like a cold mist, unseen, but always felt ships began patrolling the borders. More often, diplomats whispered behind locked doors, and even the Grand Assembly Tower seemed to stand a little heavier, as though it knew something terrible was drawing closer. In the midst of all this, Elias and Syrea found themselves once again pulled back into the ceremony they had barely survived, this time not as a symbol of peace, but as a line of defense. If unity was their only hope against the unknown, then their bond had to become more than politics, more than shared silence and unspoken understanding. It had to be real, seen and sealed before both their peoples. The wedding would not be public this time, not after the last attack, but deep in the secure heart of the Vila Moonbase, known as Virith's Hold, hidden within the crust of an ancient moonstone mountain, surrounded by shielding fields and psychic dampeners. They would speak their vows with only a handful of witnesses, including the leaders of the High Council and Earth Unity Command. As the shuttle descended into the hidden city, Elias sat beside Syrea in silence, his fingers tapping softly on the armrest while she stared ahead, her eyes calm but far away, and though they hadn't touched minds in days, he could feel her. Thoughts brushing close now, like wind before a storm, restless, watching, waiting. In the days leading up to the ceremony, they were separated for preparation. Elias trained in Velari customs, taught the meaning behind every motion, every word he would have to say, while Syrea met privately with the Council of Thoughtseers, who warned her that the Lurati signal might soon evolve into something stronger, something capable of rewriting minds instead of merely watching them. Despite this, the ceremony could not be postponed again. Both species needed hope, needed proof that unity could hold even as shadows stretched closer. When the day came, they stood beneath the ancient star arch in Virith's center chamber, a place where the ceiling opened to the void above, showing a black sky cut with stars, and around them stood guards, dignitaries, scholars, and soldiers, all quiet, all waiting. Elias wore traditional human dress woven with Velari crystal threads, and Syrea wore a simple gown of starlight silk that shimmered like still water, her hair braided in silver and blue, her eyes glowing gently as she stepped toward him across the glowing stone floor. The officiant, a half-Velari priest who spoke both with voice and mind, welcomed them, and then the ritual began. First the binding of hands, wrapped in soft magnetic ribbons that responded to their pulses. Then, lighting of the twin flame, one human red, one Velari white, burning side by side in a shared bowl of clear glass. Elias spoke his part first, voice steady, every word memorized but meaningful. And as he did, he looked at her, not just as a princess or an alien, but as someone who had stood with him in silence, in fear and questions too big to answer, and still reached for him when it mattered. When it was her turn, Siraya stepped forward and lifted her chin slightly, and for a breathless moment, no one was sure what she would do then. In a voice that echoed like soft bells across stone, she said, "I vow not as command, but as choice. Not in silence, but in trust." And those listening stared in awe, for the words were hers alone, not the ones given by tradition, but something new, spoken freely. Just as she reached for Elias's hands, the chamber shook not with sound, but with pressure, a sudden weight in the air, like the world itself had inhaled and held its breath, and the psychic dampeners flickered for just a second. Then, all at once, every Velari present clutched their heads and dropped to their knees, whispering in pain, while humans looked around in confusion, unable to hear what was being screamed through the minds of the psychic-born. Siraya stood frozen, eyes wide, face pale, and Elias reached out to steady her, but she turned suddenly and shouted one word, "No." Not to him, but to something else, something none of them could see. The fire in the Unity bowl flared violently, rising in a spiral of red and white, and the ribbons on their hands burned away without touching their skin. Then came the voice, not aloud, not in mind, but in every part of the room, like thought and sound and memory tangled into one. "You speak peace where there is none. You bind flesh to fire and call it truth. We learn, we see, we answer." The ground cracked beneath their feet, the chamber's shield dome flashing erratic light, and suddenly an image appeared in the sky above them, projected. Through the star arch, a shape of dark crystal, floating through the void, smooth and cold, pulsing with slow energy. Siraya gasped and whispered, "That's not a ship. That's a mind," and Elias felt his heart drop. The Velari High Thinker tried to raise a barrier, but the moment he summoned energy, it shattered in his hands, and he collapsed, blood dripping from his ears. Siraya turned to Elias and said quickly, "They're testing us. They want to see if we break." And he asked, "From what?" She pointed to the archway and said, "From ourselves." Just then the energy flared again, and everyone in the room saw flashes, visions of war, of loss, of betrayal, not real, but drawn from deep memories, fears pulled to the surface and painted in painful light. Elias saw his father's face during the war, shouting orders before the last battle that cost him everything, and Siraya saw her mother's dying thoughts as she shielded the capital from a psychic flood. But through it all, they held on to each other's hands, grounding their minds against the rising tide. The flames in the bowl snapped back into control, burning steady again, and the voice faded slowly, not gone, but watching. Silence returned to the chamber, broken only by ragged breaths and the flicker of broken shield nodes. Then, in a voice more tired than triumphant, the officiant spoke again. "The vows are complete, the bond holds." And though the ceremony was in ruins, and the sky above no longer felt safe, everyone in that room saw something stronger than a treaty take. Form two beings, one human, one Valari, standing side by side, not as sacrifice, but as promise. That night, while the stars above Virith flickered unnaturally and sensor stations struggled to track the source of new pulses in deep space, Elias sat with Sirea in their quarters, neither of them speaking for a long while, until he finally asked, "Was that a warning, too?" Sirea nodded slowly, then said, "It was a question, and our answer was no." Elias leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Then we keep saying no every time it asks," and beside him, she smiled again, quietly, as the void beyond their world whispered once more. Elias awoke before the artificial dawn, breath shallow and heart pounding, as if his body had carried a nightmare back into waking life, and across the quiet room, Sirea stood in the shadows near the window, her silver eyes reflecting the faint starlight beyond the dome of Virith's, cold, unmoving, unreadable, but alert. Something had changed overnight, something no alarm had caught, but both of them felt it deep inside, like a shift in pressure or gravity, subtle but real. The bond from the wedding had not faded after the attack during the vows. In fact, it had deepened, tightened, and now Elias could sense not only when Sirea was near, but when her thoughts stirred, when her fear grew sharp or her resolve solid. Like a low hum in the back of his mind, she turned to him without speaking, stepped closer, and placed a small disk in his hand. A Valari memory capsule encoded with data and sound, saying softly, "They sent a message last night. Just to you." Confusion filled Elias's face, but she nodded, serious, and told him the council had intercepted a new pulse, not aimed at the assembly, not at the Valari worlds or Earth's network, but at him, buried inside a wavelength that only his specific neural signature could decode. They took him quickly to the secure lab under Virith's core, a chamber shielded with dense crystal and psychic dampeners, and as the technicians activated the capsule, a faint blue light filled the room and began to spin, forming symbols that flickered faster than any machine could track, until at last they resolved into a single line of translated text across the wall. The human exception must be broken. Silence filled the chamber like a second atmosphere, heavy and thick, and Elias stared at the words, cold running through his limbs, not because he feared for himself, but because it meant something had seen inside him past his flesh, past his thoughts, into something he didn't even understand yet. Sirea stepped closer, scanning the pulse's structure, and confirmed what the scientists had guessed. The message carried a deep pattern matching Elias's unique neurological response to Valari's psychic language. It had studied him through the earlier attacks, through his thoughts during the rift, and now it had chosen him, not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as an anomaly. The Lurati presence, whatever it truly was, had found something in him it didn't understand, and that scared everyone more than any declaration of war. Over the next hours, Elias was tested, scanned, even placed in a null thought chamber to isolate any trace of outside influence, but the results only deepened the mystery. He was still human, still normal by every standard Earth had ever set, but his mind showed unusual resistance to psychic interference, as if he could filter meaning from chaos without being broken by it. Sirea stood beside him during every test, watching in silence, and finally she said, "You listen like us, but you don't hear the same way. which led to a new theory. What if the bond formed at the wedding hadn't just connected them, but awakened something dormant, something buried deep in Elias's mind or blood, some ancient signal now echoing forward? Something dormant? As the council debated what to do, word came from the outer patrols another rift had opened, this time near a human colony in the Tau-Sirian belt, and from it emerged not a ship, not a message, but a storm, a burst of energy that erased an entire station's memory core in seconds, leaving behind only fragments, short visual logs showing flashes of a dark figure walking through empty corridors, untouched by gravity or walls, its shape shifting each time someone looked directly at it. Siraya insisted they go, and the council reluctantly agreed under heavy escort. When they arrived at the silent colony, drifting like a dead city in space, Elias felt something the moment they docked, not a voice or a vision, but pressure, like being watched by eyes that weren't made to see. They moved carefully through the quiet halls, searching for survivors or clues, and it was in the medical wing that they found one last recording, hidden deep in the emergency system, showing a technician speaking into the camera just before the blackout. We saw it. It stopped in front of the main frame, just looked at it, then turned to us, and then I heard his name, Elias. Why did it know his name? The message cut off there, and the team went still. Elias stared at the screen, feeling the echo of something behind his eyes, and then, without warning, he saw it not in front of him, but inside, a flash of shape and darkness, not trying to speak, but trying to become part of him, like a thought, forcing its way into a dream. He staggered back, gasping, and Siraya caught him just before he fell, placing her hand against his temple and whispering a Velari word that calmed the pulse in his chest. Then came the understanding. The Lurati weren't just watching anymore, they were choosing, and somehow Elias had become a door. Back on the ship, in isolation, he asked her what it meant, why him, and she told him something few knew. Even among the Velari, there had been legends of a being from long ago, not Velari, not Lurati, but something else, something that had walked among both races before they had names, a thought splitter, one who could separate false meaning from true, who could survive the Lurati mind and return unchanged. Siraya believed Elias might be the echo of that being, not by blood, but by pattern, and if that was true, it explained everything, why the messages changed when directed at him, why the Lurati had paused, instead of destroyed, why they feared what they couldn't control. And so, with time running out and the next pulse expected within days, the assembly made a desperate plan. Elias would enter the dream core, the deepest Velari psychic structure, a place where only pure thought could survive, and send a message back through the rift, not as human, not as Velari, but as himself. It was dangerous, possibly fatal, but Elias agreed, because now it was no longer just about survival. It was about the truth, about finding out what the Lurati really were, and what they wanted with minds like his. As they prepared the chamber, Siraya gave him one final warning. Once you step in, you may come out changed or not at all. He smiled faintly and replied, I've already changed. I just want to know into what. Then the core activated, and Elias stepped forward, alone, into the storm of light and memory, into the raw language of stars, carrying with him a question only a human could ask, and perhaps An answer even the void could not predict. Elias floated in a place without sky, without ground, surrounded by colors and sounds that weren't real, yet they felt more solid than anything he had ever known. And as he stepped deeper into the dream core, he began to lose the feeling of his body, of time, of thought only. Instinct and memory guided him now, and somewhere behind the storm of shifting light, he heard his name whispered like a breeze through a canyon, soft but full of weight. The core was not a place in space, it was a mind space, a creation of the Velari centuries ago, used to store knowledge too powerful for normal minds. But now it had become something else, something wild, because the Lurati had touched it. Elias moved through the swirling patterns of thought and energy, following a thread only he could see, a faint trail that pulsed gently with a familiar rhythm his own. Every step pulled him through different echoes, glimpses of battles from long ago, cries of sorrow and fear, moments of connection, and visions of unity torn apart. He saw Earth's first contact with the Velari, the silent shock between both peoples, and the long road of mistrust and misunderstanding that followed. He saw himself and Saraya at the altar, the flames rising and the silent scream that echoed across dimensions, but all of it passed like wind, never stopping him, only guiding. Deeper still, the storm began to focus, the wild colors drawing into a narrow beam of dark violet light, and from it stepped a figure, smooth and clear as obsidian, with no face, no name, but a presence so strong it made Elias freeze. It was not Lurati in the way others had described, not monstrous or cruel, but something older, colder, and yet curious. The being didn't speak, but Elias felt its thoughts sharp, direct, like needles of ice pressing gently into his mind, not to hurt him, but to understand. It showed him a galaxy before species, a time when thought was shared like breath, when unity was natural and not chosen. And then it showed the fall, how differences formed, how fear grew, how isolation became survival. The Lurati were not a species, they were a memory, a collective fear trying to become real again. And Elias understood they weren't invading, they were looking for something they lost long ago, something humans still carried without knowing, the ability to change, while remaining themselves. And he, Elias, bonded to a Velari princess, standing between two worlds, resisting the weight of ancient thought, was proof that it was still possible. The being studied him, then finally spoke not in words, but in meaning. You carry the fracture, but also the flame. Why do you not shatter? Elias thought carefully, and answered with all he had seen and felt, with every moment of trust between him and Saraya, with every breath taken in silence beside someone not like him. Because I chose not to break. And so did she. The core trembled around them, not in anger but in recognition, and the being reached out, not to harm, but to share. And suddenly Elias saw everything, not as chaos but as pattern. The Lurati weren't trying to destroy unity, they were testing for it, waiting for a signal that minds could meet again, without war. The being stepped back and slowly unraveled, fading into mist, leaving behind a single echo, then let the silence speak. Elias blinked and found himself standing once more in the chamber, Saraya rushing to him, the lights flickering back to normal as the scientists stared in awe. His vitals had flatlined for 2 minutes. Yet he was alive, stronger, and when he opened his mouth, The first words he spoke were not his own, but a message. We see. We learn. We will wait. News spread fast. The rift near Tal Sirion had closed without violence, and all the Rati signals had stopped. No more mines were attacked. No more stations fell. It was as if the entire galaxy had exhaled. In the weeks that followed, a new message was sent not through language or voice, but through Elias himself, encoded in thought, a shared broadcast translated into hundreds of languages, carrying not peace, but understanding. Earth and Vilari diplomats began meeting again, not out of duty, but out of choice, and Sirea, now both princess and bridge between peoples, worked side by side with Elias to create a new council, not of politics, but of shared thought, a place where silence was respected as much as words. Some still feared the Lirati would return, but others believed something had changed, that perhaps the memory of pain no longer ruled them. Late one night, as Elias stood alone on the garden terrace of Virth's hold, he felt the breeze shift, and Sirea appeared beside him, silent for a long while, then asked, "Did you see the end?" He shook his head and replied, "No, only a beginning." Together they watched the stars, not with fear, but with a quiet hope, knowing that unity wasn't just possible. It had already begun, not with weapons or treaties, but with a choice, with a human who didn't break, and an alien who reached across the void, and a silence that finally found its voice.